I am so glad that we have Dan Neuarth here for our presentation, Working Effectively with Clients Raised in Narcissistic Families. Dan is a best-selling author based in Marin County. He specializes in helping people cope with unhealthy narcissism and those close to them. He writes a regular blog on narcissism and has given numerous presentations on the topic to both clinical and consumer audiences. He is the author of 2 books, If You Had Controlling Parents, How to Make Peace with Your Past and Take Your Place in the World, and Secrets You Keep from Yourself, How to Stop Sabotaging Your Happiness. He has been featured extensively on nationwide media, including Oprah, Good Morning America, and CNN. He has more than 25 years experience providing individual, couples, and family therapy. He holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and is licensed as a marriage family therapist in California, Florida, Texas, and Virginia. He is the current president of the Marin County chapter of RECAMFT. Let's give a big hand and welcome Dan.
Patrick, thank you. It's been about 15 years since I have been up here to one of your meetings, and you guys have grown. It used to be a smaller room, and I watch with admiration from just down the road how vital this chapter is and all the things that you're doing. It's really an inspiration to us because we're in a rebuilding time at RECAMFT. So, narcissistic families. What do I mean by a narcissistic family system? It's a pattern of behavior, and it's a confusing pattern of behavior if you grew up in a family like that. Some of the things that people will say who grow up in a narcissistic family is, I felt like I was an alien. I felt like a prisoner. I felt wrong. And there's something confusing about people with narcissistic personality disorder or a narcissistic style. There are these paradoxes. They can be so hypersensitive to perceived slights or not being the center of attention, but yet seemingly so insensitive to your feelings. Is that better? Thank you. They can be so oppositional. They seem to derive identity from being defined in opposition to people. But if you oppose or question, that's not okay. And when I talk about people with narcissism, there's always the dilemma of diagnosing, pathologizing. People who have narcissistic personality disorder or a narcissistic style are wounded. There are so many things that lead to narcissism. And we can have compassion for the wounds. So the people who come into our practices who grew up with a narcissistic parent often don't have compassion for themselves. That's one of the tasks in working with them. And I've heard stories in writing this book, If You Had Controlling Parents, which was 20 years ago. And we used the word controlling because the publishers said, not many people know what narcissism is. Let's call it controlling. That's changed now. That's another talk on why it's changed. One woman came in and said when she would go out in public, her mother would put a sign on her back that said, "Don't feed me." This woman had no weight problems as a girl. Another man said that he was a swimmer, and one time he came home from a competitive meet, and he came in second. And his father, the minute he walked in the door, said, "Take off your swim trunk and throw it in the trash." There was one man I interviewed who said, I think it was near the holidays, and so there were candles in the house. One of the candles caught fire to the curtains in the living room. And so he runs into the kitchen, and his mom and dad are talking. And he started to say, Mom, Dad. And they said, wait, don't speak until you're spoken to. He said, but Mom, Dad, shh. And so he went back and he sat on the stairs watching the house start to burn down until his parents realized it. Did they ever say he should have said anything or that they were wrong? No. People talk about growing up with mixed messages. Parents who say to their sons, for example, stand up for yourself like a man, but don't ever question my authority. Or people to say to their daughters, you need to be smart and pretty, but then they treat them in ways that make them feel not smart and not pretty. And the net effect is that if you were raised by a narcissistic parent, you're trained not to be in touch with your gut, with your heart, with your thoughts. Your relationship with yourself, your very birthright, is taken away from you by a campaign of manipulation and self-centeredness. One of the things that I find helpful for parents, or for people in clients when they're thinking about their parents, because clients come in with a varied understanding of narcissism, and it may not be a presenting problem. They come in, they just think, something's a little off in the way I grew up. Or maybe they're very well educated and they come in and say, my dad was a narcissist. But it helps people to have a basic understanding of what narcissism is. They can look it up online, they can look it up in the DSM. The metaphor I like is that if you have a narcissistic character, it's like being a tire that's always leaking air, all the time. That air is self-esteem. And if you have a narcissistic style or personality disorder, you can't fill it yourself, or you think you can't. So you have to take it from those around you in the form of narcissistic supply, attention, status, accomplishment, admiration. And who are the readiest people there to give you that are your children. All right. So there are so many different kinds, styles, forms that narcissism shows up in. Some people stand out like a 5,000-watt light bulb. Other people are curmudgeonly. And our clients will tell us the whole range. How did I get interested in this? Well, I had a very narcissistic dad, very successful businessman, CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and he ran our family like a business. And sometimes the things he did to my sister and I, a younger sister, were sort of comical. Every fall, right about this time, he would have us rehearsing to catch the school bus. So a week before school started, we would have breakfast, we would get our school clothes, we would get our books, materials ready. He'd be timing us and we'd be out at the curb to wait for the school bus in Rochester, New York, where I grew up. The only problem with that is that the week before the school bus drivers were learning their routes. And while all the other kids were on vacation, sleeping in, the Newhart's kids were standing out there ready for the bus. My father wanted things to work well. He wanted things to work well for him. But there was a darker side. I, like many of the clients that perhaps you've had, grew up thinking that if I needed this much negative attention and control, there must be something fundamentally wrong with me. I felt wrong as a person. I was not the kid the rebellious kid who would question this from my parents. I wasn't, and I've had some clients over the years who said, early on, I knew something was wrong here. And that can be an advantage, although it's an isolating experience. I thought what was wrong was me, so I worked really hard to try and be right. I remember the first time I was in my early 30s, and I went in for counseling as part of my requirement to get my master's. And I've been seeing this counselor, a wonderful counselor, for, 3-4 months. And she said, sort of gingerly, I think you may have grown up in an emotionally abusive family. And I was shocked. No one had ever used those words. We were a family like a politician's family where appearances were what mattered. Image. Image is important to narcissists. And I went away thinking, I'm going to have to fire her. She can't say this. But I didn't. And I started looking at that. And I was in my 30s. I thought what I grew up with was normal. And you probably hear that, or maybe have experienced that from people in many forms of dysfunctional family, and alcoholic families, narcissistic families. And so part of the tasks of therapy is validating that experience, that it was not normal and it was not okay. On the tables there are handouts. Did anyone not get a handout? A couple in the back. If you have extras at your table, maybe you could pass them back. Thank you so much. One of the ways of validating is on page 2 or 3. There's a checklist of 75 questions of experiences you may have had. If someone checks half of those, they came, in my experience, this was developed through some of the research I did, they came from a family that was not healthy. I've had clients check out of 75, 69, 70, 71. Because narcissistic parenting is a pervasive campaign. It's not an isolated thing. So there's 7 tasks that aren't linear that I find are helpful in working with someone who came from a narcissistic upbringing. And they're on the front page of your handout. The first one is to name it. Remember Betty Friedan in the book, The Problem That Has No Name? When you name something, when you give it a name, it gives meaning to people's lives. They can do something with it. And not just naming it, but validating it. This happened. The second step, and again, these aren't linear, these happen throughout the therapy, is to make sense. People want to know why they did this. Why did my parents do this? Was it me? Was it them? There are reasons. One of the key parts we know of therapy is to make connections between what happened then and how it influences you now. What's the legacy? How is it affecting you now in ways that you want to change? If you grew up with a narcissistic upbringing, chances are you have a very strong critical voice. You have an inner critic. You internalize this voice of your parents. And I find working with people who come from narcissistic upbringing, working with that inner critic, and there's so many ways, internal family systems or voice dialogue, and obviously ways such as EMDR or brain spotting, where you can look at that voice that for some clients, they may not know that that voice isn't them. The voice that says, why'd you do that? That was silly. And then when you do it, they said, and then when you don't do it, they say, why didn't you do that? That's what the voice does all the time, working with the inner critical voice. Ultimately,
the shorthand of what I try and do, whatever their parents did, I do the opposite. You know, a lot of clients will come in and they'll say, their nightmare is, what if I'm a narcissist? I don't know about you, but if people are wondering if they're a narcissist, they're probably not. Because you don't hear narcissists walking around saying, oh my God, what if I'm self-centered? You know, it's like, it's either narcissism, what's that? Or, yeah, I'm a narcissist, number one. And I think it's helpful to tell people that. If you're wondering about it, and you can go through the DSM criteria on your handout. You can even go through it with sometimes if people are really worried about it. Sometimes it's helpful to reality test it, to put that one to rest. So what do clients come to us for? If you have an answer. Right. So the comment was trust oneself and accept oneself. Self-trust and self-acceptance. Clients are coming in, they want to be seen and heard for who they are. But many of them are expecting that once again they won't be. They come in wanting to be honored and met, but their fear that they're going to be used once again, even in therapy. I remember the first time I went to a male therapist, which was problematic. I chose females as my dad. Great therapist, and after about the fourth or fifth session, he looked at me and said, I get the feeling that you think that I'm a good enough guy, but if our interests ever diverged, I'd sell you out in a minute for my own interest. And without even thinking, I said, yeah. That was my worldview. People use you. People will sell you out. Even therapists. And him identifying that, and then I started thinking about, what's it like to go through life expecting that? You know, those are the moments in therapy when people can reflect on their worldview and things open up. Clients want to be allowed to be who they are, but they grew up in families where their decisions were questioned, where their decision muscles didn't get a chance to develop. Clients want to be encouraged to solve their own problems, not told what to do. Although they will ask us, what should I do? I do. I ask my therapist all the time. He's never answered. I don't get it. And our clients will pull for us in some ways, sometimes, to do the things that they fear because they want to know, are we safe? This isn't unique, obviously, to people who grew up in narcissistic families. This is therapy. One of the things that helpful is to be able to for someone to tell their story, to be heard. Because a lot of times they'll talk to friends about their parents, and maybe there'll be a twinge of disloyalty in the friends, or they'll say, well, you know, your parents, they tried to do their best, or they can't hear it, and you get re-injured. For a client to be able to say, I'll say, tell me how bad it was. Tell me what it was like. You do that. But to be able to tell their story, and that there are ways to help them sometimes if they need it. You know, when I was doing interviews for this book, I would sit and turn on the tape recorder and say, so what makes you think, say you came from a controlling or narcissistic family? I didn't have to ask many questions after that. They were ready to say, example after example after example. I remember the guy who had the ex-Marine dad who nobody could pick up. When he picked up the fork, that was their signal to start eating. I remember the mom who was described when her daughter went to college and went to, what's the breaker? Organic chemistry, and she didn't do well in organic chemistry, and she was supposed to be a doctor. And the mom was crestfallen for 3 or 4 seconds, and then she said, okay, then you'll be a lawyer. And it's these stories that people tell us that maybe they've never had a chance to tell anybody and be listened to and reflected upon. People wonder, why do people who are narcissistic act the way they do? And I think one of the pitfalls is you can spend a lot of time talking about the parent. And it's helpful for a while. They want to know, why did they do it? What did it mean? How could they do this? Because it's so different. And it's helpful to give answers. At some point, they need to look at the impact on them. But one of the ways that helps some clients is to say, you know what? And this is oversimplified and you may not agree with this view, but in a way, we've all been there. We've all had our narcissistic time. If you're a baby, you cry and your parents figure it out. Are you hungry? Are you wet? Are you bored? I don't care, figure it out. But we don't stay there. And sometimes it's helpful to say, you know, narcissistic people are really developmentally in some ways like children. You know, what does a kid do when they're caught with their hand in the candy jar or the cookie jar? They deny it. Who? What? Me? Or they tell you other things, some good things they did. Or they distract, or they throw a tantrum. Adult narcissistic behavior is just sophisticated forms of a kid with his hand in the cookie jar. And when people see these metaphors, they can say yes. And what this does is they can externalize. They can say, wait a minute, my parent has a problem. I didn't cause that problem. That problem affected me. And it now starts to make sense. And when you can externalize a problem, it doesn't have its hold on you. Depending on the stage where people are at, there is education about narcissism that is so helpful. You know, to be able to say, there's something missing psychically, like the tire that's leaking air. There's some void that needs filling or attention. Always, endlessly. And sometimes people will say, well, I kind of feel empty sometimes. Do I have that? I'm not talking about an existential aloneness or emptiness we hear sometimes. We're talking about the void in emptiness and character of narcissism that's so profound that it dictates a person's life. And their life is designed, like in The Wizard of Oz, or the emperor has no clothes, the emperor's new clothes, to cover up that void, the feeling of flawed, the feeling of shame. And the way people with narcissism cover that up is by making you feel bad about yourself. That distracts. By never admitting they're wrong. By always having to be the best. Let me ask a question. And it'd be good to have mics for this. How do you know when you're with someone who may be narcissistic? Raise your hand. If you have how do you know? How can you tell? Down here?
In the room, I treat a lot of couples, and in the room, you can start to see the movement, and there's immediate defense and denial, but then they start moving in a particular way in their body. They're moving away from their spouse, and you can just start to see their eyes shift. There's more of a fluttering going on, and it's usually my first marker that I'm dealing with somebody, at least with a narcissistic defense, if not a full-on narcissist, somewhere on that spectrum.
Yes. It's palpable. Yes, thank you. Who else? Right here.
It's kind of like all my bullshit meters go off. And I'm not feeling emotionally attuned to them. So they may be really clearly upset about something and I want to yawn. Or there's some physical cue in me that says there's something not congruent here with what's happening. So what you said as well, but that's my visceral response.
Right. Bullshit meters. You feel it. Thank you.
Similarly, I find I clench my teeth. That's my first.
Clenching teeth. Yeah.
That they'll either talk totally about themselves or they won't say anything, even if you ask them about themselves, but all their choices will be their own and not incorporating anyone else's input.
Right. Right back over here, there's a couple.
I was going to say self-insight is very low.
Right, there's not a huge interest among people with narcissism in self-reflection. They want to be reflected. They don't want to.
It's often, there's a sense of entitlement that I should make exceptions for them, or they should be treated differently.
Yes, entitlement.
Hello. Just the impulse in the field, so either as a therapist or as a member of the family, but the impulse to just want to go along with them, to reinforce them, to sort of, basically acknowledge and appreciate and further their own claims. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
I have two personal examples because now, okay. So my mom, I always knew there was something off. We were at a brunch with the whole family. This was when I was younger, before I had kids. And she stood up at a breakfast that we were all out at a restaurant and said, and just out of the blue, says, I have an announcement to make. Okay, Mom. She goes, I've never been wrong in my life. So my sister and I were laughing. And then the other one was when I did have kids, we got into an argument on the phone one time. And she told me I was raising my kids all wrong. And so I said, well, we need to talk about this. So give me a call when you can talk about it. 3 years later, and we were living in the same town, she made no contact with me, and I finally had to call her. So, need I say more?
Right. Thank you. Yes, because there's something off. And as therapists, because we observe people all day, I mean, these are great cues and clues. But could you imagine if you didn't know what the phenomenon was? You just felt something icky or off that would make you question yourself, because that's what narcissistic parents do, is they turn it back on the child. I can't tell you how many people who've said, I never heard my dad or mom say they were wrong or say, I'm sorry. I never heard that. Can you imagine what it would be like to go through life without having the tools to be able to say, I'm wrong, I made a mistake, I need help, can you help me? I don't know everything. it's not a good existence. But we don't question that. We question ourselves growing up with a narcissistic parent. And that's where these distortions come in. Please.
Wait, Juanita. What kind of, can you hear me? What makes a person narcissistic? Is it their parents were narcissistic, or what causes someone to be narcissistic?
That is a great question. And the research is divided and not conclusive. Obviously, trauma sometimes in early life can lead to development of narcissism, but not everyone who's traumatized becomes a narcissist. There's the theory that people are over-empowered, and so they are used to being entitled, or that they're so deprived and abused that this is the defense that they formed. Maybe there's a gene. We'll find out. But people want to know why. Of course you want to know why. When something's had that much power over your life, you want to know why. You want to understand it. Thank you. I had a guy in his 30s who came in and said, you know, in our family we always had to say, Mother, may I speak? Or Father, may I speak? And if they didn't say those words, they weren't listened to. You know, there's not a First Amendment in narcissistic families. There isn't freedom of speech. There isn't the right to dissent. And so you grow up with certain distortions. And there's different ways of looking at it, but I think that there are 5 things that are distorted. Because you grow up, if you have a narcissistic parent, you grow up with this worldview of often that there are winners and that there are losers. And you're going to be one or the other. And usually the parent wants to be the winner at the loser's expense. And then you see this play out, particularly in relationships later. Someone who had a narcissistic parent, they don't want to be narcissistic, but do I want to be the winner or loser? I don't want to be a loser. I can't be a loser. I grew up as a loser. And so I'm going to, not deliberately, but I'm going to inflict on my partner that other position. I'm going to be the winner. And then when people see that, they're horrified. But it's freeing. The legacy of a narcissistic upbringing can be profound. I remember one person that I interviewed talked about how at one point there was this very chaotic family that she grew up in, and she described, she said, I took some essence of myself, and I buried it in the hardwood floor in our dining room for safekeeping. And 30 years later, she was saying, how do I get that back? How do I get that central part of me back? It's a great question, and it's a great metaphor. And we're going to talk a little bit about the ways you can help clients get that back. One of the things that I sometimes, you have to have, if you can, with the clients appropriately. I forget who was it who said, you know therapy's over when you can tell jokes with your clients. I don't know. But one of the tools that I think is very helpful is for people to be able to see how narcissism works in very specific ways. And one tool that I work with clients, I say, you know, narcissists have a real confusion about where they end and other people begin. You know, I've heard people talk about how their parents said, you're one of the most wonderful things anyone could own. Thing that is owned. There's an expectation expectation among many narcissistic parents that you have to earn their love. You don't get it, you got to earn it. And it's conditional. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes repeatedly. And that has such a corrosive effect. And so one of the things is to be able to say to clients, look, they've got a little bit of confusion about who they are. And you see this in the pronouns they use. And the way you get to the truth of what a narcissistic person is saying, more times than not, is you reverse the pronouns. For example, if a parent says, "You don't deserve all I've given to you," you take the you don't deserve all I've given to you, second person, and you make it first person, and then you take the other you, I don't deserve all you've given to me. Now, if a parent says, "You don't deserve all I've given to you," and you can hear what they're saying is, "I, the parent, don't deserve all you give to me," which is more true? Which is more accurate? And that's empowering. Somebody I spoke to said her nighttime ritual with her mother was she would go to the little makeup, whatever they used to call it, vanity. Thank you so much. I'm old enough, I should know that. And the mom would sit there and the daughter would brush her hair 100 strokes every night. And as part of the ritual, the daughter would tell the mother how beautiful she was. Now, what's wrong with that picture? It's backwards. Narcissism is backwards. It's a distortion. Projection is rampant in narcissism. And for people to see that with, like, reverse the pronouns, that's going to be more true, is freeing. Because they have this secret little code. One of the things that can be so helpful is observation. You know, people talk about, "Oh God, I got to go back and visit my parents." Well, you know, the question is, how do I not lose myself? How do I not regress? I always say, you're probably going to regress. Let's see how long it takes. If you can go 3 hours, that's good. And watch, track, how does it happen? Give clients a research project, and nothing can go wrong because it's all data, and they can come back and talk with you about it. I remember going to see my dad once back east, and I had a little clicker counter, like in golf, to count the narcissistic manipulative things he would do very silently. And it started by I got to the motel and checked in on the phone, and he was saying, "Okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, you're going to do that." This is, and like within the first day, it was like up to 67. And then you think about, how does that affect a child? Day in, day out, all that stuff. And people have to recognize that it has a profound effect, and it wasn't their fault. You know, it's helpful for clients to realize you're not responsible for what your parents did. They are. But you're responsible for what you do now. They're not. They still think they get to tell you, but they're not. And so unpacking distortions is so important with any sort of a dysfunctional family. I mean, you know, the characteristic phrase of an alcoholic family, don't trust, don't talk, don't feel. Those are the unspoken rules. That's true in narcissistic families. There's a lot of parallels. When you think about it, alcoholism is the ultimate narcissistic act. Your addiction is more important to you than anything else. So I like the Wizard of Oz. Please, you have a question? Comment. Can we wait for the mic? Sorry. Thank you.
I was raised in a military family and told that my job was to make the family look good. And my father was abusive.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's one of the real problems. There's this Jekyll Hyde paradox that's so problematic if you grew up in a narcissistic family is often you see your parent being a certain way out in public and they're admired, but then they come home and they're different. And how do you square that? And no one believes you. And that's why I like the Wizard of Oz. That's why I like that scene where Toto goes and pulls the curtain back, and here's this fiery Oz, which is a complete illusion. It's the ultimate narcissistic metaphor. And then when unmasked, the professor says, don't pay any attention to that man behind the curtain, because it is a facade. The narcissistic facade is what it's all about. It's about image. It's about looking good. It's about no one ever pointing out, wait a minute, this isn't right. You're a fraud. You have a double standard. Why is it you get the best clothes and we wear thrift store clothes? Why is there this double standard? You don't ask that unless you're a rebel. How many people were in the rebel role in their families? But see, one of the things is, one of the issues if you're working with someone who grew up in a family is, you're not a helpless victim or recipient of what happens. You had a role. And it's very fruitful to look at that role. How did you cope? I mean, I always try and reassure, give me just 1 second. I always try and reassure people that in my experience, as kids, we probably picked the best coping strategy, even though it has huge downsides later in life. We probably picked the best coping strategy there is. Whether it's, you're a rebel, you get to safeguard some independence. You may end up rebelling just for the heck of it, and it may not be your best interest, but you hold on to something. I was the good kid. I wanted, the model child. I wanted to get good grades and do all these things. But then I didn't know if I was doing it for me or to look good or to bring things to the family. And for people to see their role and how they coped, because they're still doing it, and then to realize you have options. You can still do that. That's your go-to role. But how about some other things? And to honor it. A lot of times we'll be very critical about, I didn't stand up for myself. Or I did and I got, abused. But you have to honor what you did to survive. And clients need to know that. And they need to internalize that. I'm sorry, please. A microphone for right here.
So the client that grew up in the narcissistic home is gonna likely have some narcissistic tendencies, and then a tendency to recreate that narcissistic relationship in the primary, like in a marriage, and how to treat all of that is my question.
Yeah, it's a good question because, yeah, you observed these things. And it can be shocking to see one's own parent in oneself, recreating things that are maybe self-centered, self-absorbed, narcissistic. But we're all capable of that. Well, or they marry someone who wants to be with a narcissist. But it's different. I mean, again, this is a continuum. And we're talking about people who actually have narcissistic personality disorder or a strong narcissistic style. We all have elements of that. But what's a narcissist's solution to problems like feelings is you ignore them, or you kill them, or you deny them. That's exactly what we don't want our clients to do. If you see that you have, a client or yourself, you see that you have certain tendencies that are maybe not that adaptive, great. Let's look at that. Let's embrace that. Why is that there? How does that serve you? You know, I had a client this week said something so profound. They said, yeah, I have a really narcissistic parent, but you know, I realized she grew up in such a horrible family that couldn't meet her needs, that she coped by being so self-centered, so focused on her needs, because that was the only way she could get them met. And you know, this is a daughter, now an adult, who suffered at the hands of this mother terribly, but was able to have compassion, to have this interpretation, this reframe of her mother saying, you know what? This is how she got her needs met. Because we're all just trying to get our needs met. But it doesn't mean that that was healthy. And it doesn't mean that you didn't pay a price.